Hello, welcome to Wheat from the Chaff on the Farmgate podcast channel. I'm ffinlo Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Joe Stanley, writer and head of sustainable farming at the GWCT Allerton Project.
And it's a fairly gloomy morning in Dorset, but there is a bright spark, and that's that we're joined for this programme by a special guest. Ben, tell us who you are and where you're from.
Good morning. I'm Ben Raskin. I'm the head of Agroforestry at the Soil Association. I'm an agroforestry practitioner, an author and an independent consultant.
Fantastic. That's lovely. Well, we're going to talk through a few different things. We're going to touch on the spending review. We're going to talk about agroforestry. We're going to talk about net zero and building resilience. We're going to look at fossil fuels and the Scottish Government's decision to reject the Committee on Climate Change recommendations to reduce livestock numbers. So there's a lot to get through. We're going to start off with the spending review. Now, the title that we had, the headline on 8.9, was Hard-Won Settlement, a Relief for Nature-Friendly Farmers. And first of all, clearly, this was a hard-won settlement, and I think we have to acknowledge that this was a success for DEFRA ministers and a testament, really, to the collective efforts of farming organisations, from the NFU to the Nature Friendly Farming Network and the Soil Association, but also to the NGOs. There was a real sort of collective effort, wasn't there, to try and make the point that agriculture and nature go hand in hand, and that agriculture and farmers need the funds in order to be able to make that transition to more agroecological practices. And Martin Lines, the CEO of the Nature Friendly Farming Network here, this is a quote from him in the article, and then I'll hand over to you, Joe, for your thoughts. So, given the challenging economic climate, it's a relief that the budget for nature friendly farming has been largely protected. Ministers have listened to our calls to recognise the value of nature friendly farming and what it can do. Investing in nature friendly farming isn't a luxury, he says. It's essential to future-proof British farming, protect our communities and secure our food production. This investment benefits everyone, whether protecting communities from devastating flooding, supporting affordable renewable energy, or ensuring high quality food is available on supermarket shelves. What did you think, Joe?
No, absolutely. I mean, Martin's bang on there. And of course, given the fairly millenarian leaks that were coming out of DEFRA prior to the announcement of the spending review, absolutely, we were thinking we might be dealing with anything up to and including a 20% cut in DEFRA's budget. In the end, just to have a look at some actual facts and figures here, the DEFRA's budget settlement is going to go from around £7.3 billion in the current financial year up to £7.4 billion by the end of this Parliament. Now, that's great, right? It's increasing, it's not decreasing. So absolutely, and I think you're absolutely right, Ffinlo, that again, given what we were hearing, then it would seem, or certainly let's it's not beyond the realms of imagination, that very coordinated approach between, yes, farming organisations of all spectrums and the environmental NGOs does seem to have actually cut through, which is testament to the effort that was put in. But in real terms, of course, that is a 2.3% cut over the lifetime of this Parliament, if we account for inflation. If we look at the Farming and Countryside Programme itself, which is kind of where we're primarily interested here, we are looking at £100 million per year cut by the end of this Parliament. So there is a reduction. We are going to have to, as Steve Reed has previously said, we are going to have to do more with less. So it is good news. Let's not distract from that. But for me, although it's absolutely not a disaster, it is a missed opportunity. I often say to ministers and civil servants, give us £4 billion and we'll change the world. We're still going to be there by the end of this Parliament on 2.3 billion, which is less in nominal terms than we were getting more than a decade ago. But we are where we are now. What's important? Do you want to come back in there, Ffinlo?
Well, I was just going to say that I just wanted to sort of take the figures up to the end of the Parliament, because it's up to 2.7 billion a year, isn't it, by the end of the Parliament? So, and what's important?
If you include additional funds which are going to be floating around, an extra 400 million for additional nature schemes. Now, we don't know who's going to be available, who can access those schemes. We don't know what they're going to look like. So the actual core agriculture budget is going to be 2.3 billion.
And indeed, and the ELMS funding is increasing specifically. So what happens to other funds, we're not sure. Clearly, they're going to be reducing, but the ELMS funding is going to increase from 800 million at the moment to 2 billion by the 28-29 period. But I think the key thing here is that it is a multi-year settlement, and so it does much as policy will change and much as different funds will have different values, there is a degree to which we know what's coming in terms of the money.
Absolutely, and that's key. Now, of course, the next thing is you mentioned Elms, SFI there, Finlo. What will Secretary of State, what will the Minister come back with? We're hearing next month with a broad outline of what SFI will look like. Where will that money be allocated? Will it be SFI? Will it be higher, countryside stewardship higher tier? Will it be landscape recovery? We will see. So the next question is, how will they reallocate that money? And that's important. But what I would then like to see, there's other things that government then needs to get its head around. For me, it's three main things. One, if we want to have a thriving countryside doing all the things that we've discussed that it can do, and that Martin was describing there in your quote, one, we do have to see a turnaround on the inheritance tax issue, because that, for me, would be the single biggest way to inject some confidence and some long-term thinking into the industry. Two, we need to see government to help farmers to realise more value from the food supply chain, more fairness in that food supply chain. We need to see more action in that sense. And then three, we need to see government, if nothing else, get out of the way of the nature markets, which I know, Finlo, you're a huge fan of. I'm a huge fan of. But sadly, all too often we're now seeing governments of all colours not helping to develop those markets, but actually getting in the way of farmers being able to access those markets. So this is good news, don't get me wrong, and as you say, multi-year budget settlement, but we do need to see these other things now fall into place in order to support the sorts of action that we know farmers can contribute.
And we'll come on to those nature markets in just a moment, and I think you and I are going to have a happy disagreement about exactly what the role of government is there. I don't want government to step out of the way. I want them to start stepping into helping to accelerate those markets, but and making sure that there are decent frameworks and decent investment coming in. But we'll come to that, and I think part of it is about the vision, and this is what's still lacking from government, is any sort of sense of vision as to what they really want from the countryside, what they want farmers to do. And there are conflicting messages, and certainly different farmers are interpreting those messages in different ways. Does food security mean volume and calories and get rid of the hedges, or does it mean resilience and agroecology? And so having an unspun direction of travel really would make a big difference here. As you say, that sort of plan for a natural capital market acceleration is really critical. But I think within this, there is potentially a role to identify key outcomes, key things that farmers should be trying to deliver. What does improved soil health mean, for example? How do we measure that? And I was talking to Andy Cato yesterday for a leaders interview that'll be going out in a few weeks' time. And one of the things that he was talking about is the way that it's so easy to measure water infiltration. And if you get good water infiltration, that's telling you so many different things about the soil. So if we're talking about water holding capacity, then that's potentially a good measure. So what are the things that the government wants farmers to work on? Because there are probably just a handful of those things that would really make a difference. And within that, we spoke last week, or last time we were chatting about net zero and the need to move on from a hard focus on emissions reduction and towards a focus on full carbon cycling, mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity regeneration, a whole range of different things within that. And so I think that there is a need again from government. We're going to come to Scotland later, but this is clearly something that's starting to take place in Scotland. But we need the English government, the UK government, to start thinking beyond simply net zero in terms of emissions. And so that's about resilience and adaptation and carbon cycling. And just before you come back in, Joe, Soil Association were clearly part of this collective campaign towards ministers, towards government, to say how important the money was. And indeed, we quoted the Soil Association within our article. So Ben, I wonder if you have any thoughts from a Soil Association perspective.
Yeah, I back up obviously everything that Joe and you have said already. I think it is great that we protected that. I think, however, without further investment, there's this real risk that we're going to end up, I think, with a two-tier farming system. And there's some evidence already that a lot of the farmers that did well in SFI are the larger farmers that could afford, a consultant to build their application quickly and get it in. And then that meant that some of the smaller farms, tenant farms who are on tighter margins, upland farms, so there's a real risk that the big landowners and the richer farmers will be able to implement some of this stuff. And even if there isn't the money there, they can afford to invest in climate proofing their farms, whereas the smaller, poorer, more difficult businesses are going to find that harder. And that's the risk if there isn't the money in the system, is that we end up losing a lot of those, those less profitable farmers who are so important to our food supply.
And how do you feel at this stage, Ben? Do you feel that there is an increasing level of understanding from government about this, or do you feel that there's been a money battle that's been won this time, but there still isn't the understanding that's needed to back it up?
I really worry. I think, we've said the DEFRA team have been a big part of this, and my experience within the DEFRA team is there's great people in there who do understand it. I think the wider government, it's always a struggle, and certainly my experience in previous discussions, although I wasn't so involved in this one, is that DEFRA doesn't always hold the trump cards within those discussions. It's the Treasury or it's the Home Office, with Labour, for instance. So I think that's why it's so important where we had that whole sector support, because it helped to strengthen DEFRA's hand in those negotiations. But I do worry that government doesn't really value food security. It doesn't really value agroecological farming. And so, yeah, there's still a long way to go, but it is much better than where we were previously. So,
Joe, do you want to come back in?
No, I agree. And look, I mean, again, let's be sort of realistic. DEFRA's just had the third largest cut of any department in this spending round. So again, it's not as bad as we feared, but still DEFRA has not come out on top. And again, when we talk about all the cross-governmental, cross-societal issues that we face, that farming and therefore, DEFRA with its role there can help to solve, from the health of our people all the way through to the resilience of our economy in the face of climate change. Yeah, again, clearly this is a missed opportunity. It was a missed opportunity to invest literally, another £1 billion. How much have we just agreed to additionally spend on the NHS, on defence, on all these other things? We can find the money for the priorities that the government of the day settles on. We spend £1.3 trillion a year. What was an extra £1 billion to put into the countryside in order to achieve all of these great things? But we are where we are. So again, it's welcome that hopefully, for me, I mean, again, just talking about SFI briefly, I would like to see, again, more money being put into SFI in future to enable the greatest number of farmers across the greatest part of the country to access that. I think it would be a mistake, personally, if we were to try to put more of that money into landscape recovery or into higher tier, as important as those things are. But I want to see, with this small pot of money, let's be honest, I want to see it going as far as possible in order to achieve, landscape scale change across a greater part of the country. Of course, ideally, we'd have more money to play with, but we are where we are. So I hope when we do see ELMS re-announced this summer, we will see a more universalist approach rather than, I think, what would be a mistake of focusing it essentially in the uplands and the coastal areas in order to get what government or Treasury might consider to be bigger bang for buck.
It comes back to vision, doesn't it? All the time we're coming back to, what does the government want from agriculture? What does the government want from land? And I think, to a large extent, what the government wants is for farmers not to receive any money, particularly to produce food. They're prepared to pay for some environmental stuff, but they're not prioritizing that. And they want the market to grow. They want the rural economy to grow without an awful lot of input from government. And as we know, that is the wrong approach. Government has been directing the rural economy. It's been directing farming and agriculture and land use for decades. And if it wants to make that transition, then that's going to be a gradual transition. It's not something that can happen overnight. And of course, there is so much that we all benefit from: the role of land, the role of agriculture, the role of food systems, in terms of all those things that you've just talked about, Joe, in terms of the health service, in terms of ecology and security and food security. And I'm sort of separating those things out, that, national security requires that we are able to make sure that we don't have the flooding at the levels that we're expecting to, that we're able to continue producing food. I just want to move on to the next subject, because, it's a continuation of a theme, really. And this is government in new push with business to restore nature. So the UK government has launched a call for evidence on boosting private sector investment in nature recovery, delivering a key recommendation of the Corey review from a while back. A DEFRA spokesperson said, whether powering Britain's industry, safeguarding our food security, or protecting public health, over a half of global GDP is highly or moderately dependent on nature. I mean, I'd go further than that, but anyway. DEFRA said that promoting investment opportunities in nature creates opportunities for business growth across multiple sectors, including farmers looking to diversify their revenues, agri-food businesses securing supply chain resilience, insurers and water companies reducing costs from flooding, droughts and pollution, developers managing climate and environmental risks to new homes and infrastructure, as well as growth in the tourism and recreational sectors. So government there has this inquiry, effectively this review into nature markets, into the role of nature recovery, blended finance, etc. Joe, why do you want government to step out of the way on nature markets?
Well, I would actually agree with you, Fino. I would like government to grasp the importance of these markets, which it itself has created here in England. The thing is, though, it feels like we're so far from them being sort of beneficial players in that. I almost just want them to get out of the way, because I think that's more likely than them actually being a constructive player. And that kind of sounds strange, right? Given everything you've just said, given the fact that they've just convened this roundtable. I went to a Number 10 event 2 years ago where they were essentially trying to do speed dating between some of these big companies and farmers to try and, kickstart that. But the reality is there seems to be this huge disconnect between the press releases and the flashy photo ops and then what happens at the ground. The previous Conservative government tried to strangle nutrient neutrality as a way to boost numbers of house building was the argument. This government seems like it's trying to undermine those nature markets again with its infrastructure and planning bill, with the potential, again, it's just the potential, but let's be honest, the worst case scenario is not unheard of happening when it comes to government policy, to essentially have Natural England playing the monopoly role in those nature markets and cutting farmers entirely out of the loop, when organisations such as cluster groups, the environmental farmers groups, which were set up in order to leverage essentially and be able to enable farmers to take an active role in those nature markets, they exist already. Why aren't we helping them? Why aren't we pushing them? Why are we trying to find alternative routes to satisfy our sort of nature obligations when it comes to development? So I don't want government to step out. I want them to actually engage with this in good faith and help farmers who are desperately trying to engage with these markets to do so. And just I'd written down the same quotes you had there, Finlo, with the exception I'd also put that the government press release says that natural capital generates more than £35 billion a year in economic benefits to just the English economy. So again, why are we being so parsimonious when we're talking about this? If you're talking about the difference between £1 and £2 billion being put into the budget for things like landscape recovery, when we know, when even the government is saying it's generating many times that in returns, why is there this mindset from Treasury that it's not important, it doesn't matter? And of course, yes, great, let's get the private sector in, fantastic, but again, we are not seeing that happening at the scale we need it to happen, at the pace we need it to happen, and we are already looking at a huge funding gap, therefore, in this area.
I think it's about what we require from government, isn't it, to a large extent? And I think it's about trying to build market confidence. And as you say, there isn't an awful lot of that at the moment for a whole range of different reasons. And so there are things that the government just needs to do, or Treasury needs to do, in order to restore confidence across the board. But there are things also specifically in relation to nature markets and how they work, and how public utilities, different companies feel able to invest, how those blended finance models work. And of course, it's the Green Finance Institute that's working with government on this particular consultation, and they're going to play a key role going forwards. And so it's how regulation can help and support a market. And I suppose if we think about the carbon market, and that old sort of management, I can't remember what you call it, a sort of idiom, if you like, where you've got the storming, norming, performing, and all this sort of thing. So you've got, within the carbon market, we've had this sort of burgeoning Wild West where lots of different people have been thinking about carbon, monetizing carbon in different ways. And there's been excitement in that market and expansion in that market. But we've got to the point where there is a recognition that there's too many differentials. There are too many different ways of doing this. It's almost sort of pricking that bubble of confidence in that market opportunity. And at that point, you really need regulators to step in, create a bit of standardization in order. And that's sort of going from the storming to the norming. And then to get to that next stage of real delivery, genuine scaling, which is the performing element. And I think that there is a role for government in that, but government needs to recognize that that is an empowering role, and it needs to get on with it, because frankly, if they spend 5 years thinking about how to standardize this, then that's no help at all. It needs to be, a fast process. And then, this is something that's been talked about for a very long time, certainly, many years across the whole sort of Brexit period, is a nature investment bank. And therefore, having a proper sort of infrastructure bank that is monetized by government in order to be able to help to kickstart some of these more expensive landscape recovery approaches. And I think, looking at those sorts of things could be really helpful. Do you have any thoughts on this, Ben?
Yeah, it's interesting to know. When I talk to farmers about carbon and nature markets, I think there's two things that come out. One is just a general lack of trust. They don't know who to believe. They don't know, who might be a good person to go with, as you say, that sort of Wild West element of it. The other element, I think, is a nervousness about tying yourself into long-term agreements. And I think one of the successes with the Agroforestry SFI was we got them to understand that we could take out some of the permanents, and that would encourage farmers to stick their toe in the water. You have no idea as a farmer what you want to be doing in 30 years' time. And if you've tied yourself up into some really tight agreement, then you find out 15 years down the line you've undervalued it, or you want to change, or what happens if you're trying to sell the farm. So there is an element, I think, of needing to be able to bring more versatility and more flexibility into some of these things, even if that doesn't get such a big price. But as a farmer, maybe I want to try it for 5 years and see if it really works, and then review it. So getting more flexibility, but also, as you say, the regulations so that we can trust who we're going with. I think those two things probably would encourage more.
And do you think that comes back to confidence? Because the idea that anybody is uncomfortable with planning 25 years in the future, it doesn't necessarily stand up to scrutiny. When you think, if people are going to stick millions of pounds into investment in a new milking parlour and a dairy farm, that's infrastructure that's locking them into a model for probably 25, 30 years. If we get a mortgage just as individual people, then that's going to be 25, 30 years. So we're comfortable with making plans, even though, frankly, we don't know what we're going to be doing in 25, 30 years' time. We're comfortable with that sort of time period. It's just that when it's a mortgage, we know, or we have a belief that the banks are still going to exist. We have a belief that we're still going to be able to pay back in that time. If we're investing in that milking parlour, there's a belief that milk will continue being drunk and that processors will continue wanting it. So really, it's about confidence in those markets, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess you're right. But I think if we're not going to get the regulation within the next 3 to 5 years, which is possible, then having more flexibility would still allow you to get into that. But I think you're right. If you were confident in what you were investing in, then you would plan that far ahead. But at the moment, a combination of those two things, I think, makes it unattractive.
Yeah,
plus there's so much just uncertainty around Finland. What will actually be the smart money is on that. At the end of that 30-year term, if you're doing BNG, for example, that will then become permanent and you won't be able to. But we don't know. We still don't know what the exact tax treatment of these things are. So you're right. It is a wider piece around uncertainty. Of course, if you stick a new milking parlour in and you want to stop milking in 5 years, you can always sell the milking parlour. Whereas if you've done permanent land use change, there is a more fundamental, worry there that you are devaluing your business in the long term, right? So yeah, you're right. I agree, Finlo. There is certainly a similarity there, but again, this is such uncharted waters, and again, there's such chopping and changing with where the government's coming or going on this. That it is. I think it is a little bit scary for a lot of people.
Joe, I want to talk about Waitrose and their approach to net zero, and I want that to help us segue into agroforestry, because Ben's joined us and obviously he's an agroforestry expert, and it'd be lovely to spend a bit of time talking about that. So Waitrose Net Zero Farm Fund aims to build resilience. And what's nice about this is, again, from my perspective, I feel like I've spent many years now talking about the way in which emissions are not the only game in town when it comes to the ecological security and ecological crisis, that emissions reduction transition is really important. But if we're thinking of net zero simply in terms of that, in terms of agriculture and land use, we're missing out so many other things and potentially creating distortions that make emissions worse in the first place. So they've just put a lot of money, he says, scratching through his notes.
£500,000.
Thank you very much, Joe. £500,000 fund aimed at helping British farmers transition to low carbon farming methods. And they are talking specifically about new projects spanning a range of low carbon innovations, including water and fertilizer recycling, establishing wilded habitats alongside traditional farming, testing cover cropping in orchards, converting waste materials like poultry litter into fertilizer. And additionally, some farms planning to introduce agroforestry and wildflower planting for better water management, biodiversity and carbon sequestration, as well as the emissions element, the drawdown there as well, while others are exploring renewable energy and emissions tracking systems. As I say, the headline there is Waitrose Net Zero Farm Fund aims to build resilience. So if people want to actually, get some detail on the projects there, just go and go to 8.9.com, the land use news website, and search for Waitrose and Net Zero. Then you will get a list of the various projects that are funded there. But I'd like to move on to talking about agroforestry, which of course is, it's being recognised by Waitrose there as being important in that whole net zero journey. Now, trees have become quite divisive, haven't they? Particularly in Wales, and then sort of leading outwards across the UK from Wales, used as a political football in the culture wars. If we're talking about woke farming, then trees and agroforestry are very much part of that. So, Ben, could you talk us through why trees are so important in agroecological and agricultural systems?
So for me, there's two sides to it. There's the benefit they bring to me as a farmer, and that is really around climate resilience and productivity. And I think for most farms, and certainly for pretty much every livestock farm, that is a no-brainer. And the benefits that you get from integrating trees or managing trees better are fairly quick. And long lasting. I think it's a bit trickier in cropping systems, but I think the benefits are still there. And then there's all the environmental benefits, carbon sequestration being one of them. But like you, I think seeing just through that lens is really dangerous. Biodiversity, water quality, water movement within the landscape, animal welfare, all of those wider things that they deliver to society as well. So for me, the power of them and why I'm so interested in them, I'm from a horticultural background. I was a vegetable grower for many years, but the reason I'm now in agroforestry is because I see them as the easiest and quickest way to continue to produce food, but to also bring in these wider environmental benefits and climate resilience.
And could you maybe sort of talk us through some of those outcomes that you just mentioned? I mean, I'm interested in health and animal welfare, water use and wind resilience, mental well-being, even just from sort of being amongst trees. I just wonder if you could sort of give us a few examples of how trees are delivering those outcomes that you've been talking about.
So let's start with a really simple grazing system, sheep, say. And when you start to integrate trees into it, you provide shade and shelter. So typically you might be 10 degrees cooler on a really hot summer's day, or you might be 4 or 5 degrees warmer in the shelter. If you get a really harsh winter, you might end up losing fewer lambs, for instance. And then there's the study from Loughall in Northern Ireland where they saw up to 13 weeks longer grazing season from having the trees. So you're then massively boosting your productivity just because the grass is growing for longer and better. So that's one example. Andy Dibben, who I just co-wrote the Silver Horticulture book with, he's a vegetable grower in Cirencester. And he talks about leafy green crops, for instance. So lovely crop of spinach you've got in the ground. It's just about to harvest, and then suddenly you get a 70-mile-an-hour wind and everything's shredded, and you lose the entire crop. So actually, just slowing that wind down for that crop saves the crop and potentially thousands of pounds. So those are a couple of examples of how they directly benefit you as a farmer as well as those other benefits.
And presumably there are different trees that you're going to be looking at delivering those different things. So if you're growing a windbreak, then something like willow is going to be much faster growing. And I guess there's, again, within that, there's the dual use element of trees. If you can integrate fruiting trees within those sheep systems, then they're also going to be able to provide additional nutrients for those animals as well, or a secondary crop for the farmer.
Absolutely, and every tree will deliver multiple benefits to differing degrees, and that's the complicated bit, and that's one of the things that actually farmers really need help with, is understanding how to design those systems to get the maximum for their farm and for their choice. Not every farmer wants to set up a juicing business on the side. Some actually just want some trees to give shade and shelter and browse, and that's fine and relatively easy. Whereas other farmers might be really up for growing almonds and making almond butter, or so you have to work on an individual farm level. There's no sort of blueprint where you can go, right, this is what I've done, everybody now put that in their farm, because that just doesn't work.
Context is everything, as we keep saying, across agroecology and regenerative agriculture. Joe, I know that you've been experimenting with silvopasture as well.
Yeah, here at the Allerton Project, we've got two silvopasture systems. One is essentially just a heritage apple orchard with about a dozen different apple varieties, just from Leicestershire, that I think planted for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee. I mean, wonderful, right? Just 12 Leicestershire varieties of apples. Of course, we now have so few varieties that we actually kind of eat, right? But wonderful things. And then also an experimental field, where a 5-hectare plot where we've got lots of different tree densities, and essentially what we're trying to do is measure the agricultural output from those different densities alongside the natural capital that Ben was talking about there, to try and work out essentially what is the optimum of the two. What sort of tree density would perhaps be the optimum going forward, and that was planted back in 2016. So it's already producing some really interesting data. But I also went to Stephen Briggs's Silvo Arable farm recently. I've been wanting to go for ages, and yeah, fantastic. I mean, to see, again, he's got apple trees in rows with crops growing between them, and you could see, and he said, he had seen absolutely that the closer to the tree rows that his crops got, the bigger the yield, the taller the crop, the healthier the crop. So it was
counterintuitive, isn't it? Because a lot of farmers go, no, crops aren't going to grow near the trees, or the grass won't grow near the trees. And actually, particularly in a really hot year, it's the opposite. So yeah.
Absolutely, and he said it absolutely as well, Ben. That whole shielding effect from heavy wind near harvest, that really did work for him. So no, I mean, and I come from a very kind of cynical background on this as well myself. A very conservative farming background. I once suggested, I think, putting some cows into an established shelter belt, and I was looked at on the family farm as if I'd completely lost my mind. So yeah, I'll be honest. When we have farmer groups here at the Allerton Project, it's the agroforestry which gets the most cynical kind of feedback, right? So there is a mindset here in the UK, I think, that this is a scary thing. But I think, when you do get into it, when you try to explain some of those benefits, you can start to change mindsets. Of course, challenges as well, land values, permanency, tenancies, all this sort of thing, of course. But yeah, we do need to, I think, be looking at agroforestry, for me, primarily as a means to build in climate resilience going forward.
Joe, tell me about those farmers who come to the Allerton Project and their view. You say that they're sort of more sceptical, a bit more sort of tittery around the idea of agroforestry. What is it, do you think, that's putting them off at that point? And when you've spent half an hour with them, sort of taking them around, showing them what you're doing, do you think that attitudes begin to change a bit?
Sometimes the often you'll get a thanks at the end of the day. The farmers will come up to you and they'll shake your hands. They go, well, my lads. Often they'll say, really interesting. Didn't agree with a lot of it, but that agroforestry especially. But really interesting day. That's kind of the feedback you often get. Yes, some people you can start to, and let's be honest, I was going to say some people's minds you can change. You're not going to change many people's minds in half an hour, right? But hopefully you can plant a seed that going forward people will start to think about this. But I think the main thing, frankly, it's that permanent land use change. Beetle banks were developed by the GWCT to help get invertebrates into the middle of arable fields. Now, why beetle bank? Why not a hedge? Well, because a beetle bank's less threatening. It's not a permanent land use change. You can get rid of a beetle bank if you wanted to. So there is a long ingrained, let's be honest, thought among farmers that bigger, more open fields are more productive, and that's where we've been pushed for
which has
decades
been exacerbated
and decades.
by natural England. Let's be fair.
Yeah, so yeah, we're pushing back in many cases against a really long sort of corporate memory, if you like, when we're asking farmers to put to cover their land in trees once again.
No, you talk about planting a seed there, and it would be great. Obviously, different seeds grow at different rates, and so we need attitudes to change at the speed at which a birch tree grows, rather than an oak tree or a beech tree. Ben,
and they are changing. I mean, from 10 years ago, it's unbelievable. We can't keep up with demand for farmers wanting help with agroforestry, whereas 10 years ago, we would go, what agroforestry? What's that?
So just talk us through, because I wanted to come back to you and ask you for a definition of silvopasture, because it's a term that we've used, and then to ask you about the work that you've been doing at Helen Browning's farm. So could we start off with the definition of silvopasture?
Well, I don't really do definition. I mean, my definition of agroforestry is the deliberate integration of trees into farming, or the deliberate management of trees for farming. So pretty much every farm in the country will have at least one tree, but mostly they haven't been seen as part of the farming. It's been seen as either entirely or mostly separate, and it's a cost that you have to deal with. You've got to, flail the hedge, or you've got to drive your tractor around the tree in the middle of the field. And it's not something that farmers feel contribute to their farming. And I think the change is shifting that, so that you go, well, actually, every tree is delivering something to my farm. And what I'd like to get to is the point where every farmer, when they're making a farming decision, considers trees as part of the option for that decision. Now, obviously, it won't always be right to have a tree. I'm not suggesting trees should be in every field or in every enterprise. But if you've at least thought, oh, I wonder if a tree could help me in that, and then you decide that it doesn't, that's fine. You've considered it. So it's that thinking about trees as a farming tool, in the same way that you might think a tractor or an animal or labor as a farming tool, because they do deliver so much. So that's how I tend to think of it, rather than exact definitions of is a single tree agroforestry, is a hedge agroforestry. So
yeah, absolutely. And just in terms of trees and the integration on farm, and the way that is really still so innovative, and there are so many different ways that farmers are approaching that. I think it's so exciting, and we are going to be making more podcasts around agroforestry, visiting more farms over the course of the rest of this year. But just talk us through, Ben, before we go to a break, just talk us through Helen Browning's farm and the work you've been doing there over the last 9 years, is it?
It is, yeah, 9 years last month. So Helen Browning has a farm near Swindon in Wiltshire. The whole farm is about 1,600.
Sorry, and Helen Browning, of course, being the chief executive of the Soil Association.
She is, yeah. She's my boss twice. So she has a 1,600 acre farm in Wiltshire. Most of it actually is tenanted from the Church of England, and is in the process of being handed over to her daughter and son-in-law for management. But so I've been working with Helen on the 200 acres that she owns, and we've been gradually planting up that 200 acres to different types of agroforestry. So it's an experimental system. We're trying different layouts, different crops, different ways of integrating. It's a silvopasture system, so the dairy is the main enterprise on the farm now. We're too far from the milking parlour to have the milking animals, so we tend to get the young stock or the dry cows into our system. We're trialling lots of different fruits and nuts. We're trialling browsing systems. We've got grazed woodland. We're trialling the roundel designs of planting, inspired by Mark Franklin at the Woodland Trust. So aiming for it to be a resource for anyone that wants to come and see what's worked and what hasn't. And there's certainly plenty that hasn't worked. But equally, we're growing almonds, we're growing apricots. I've just put some figs in. So, we're willing to take, to see what works. And we're on heavy clay as well, which is not necessarily the best for some of these trees. But we've got a big crop of almonds this year, which is quite exciting. So yeah, lots going on. And I think the biggest sort of takeaway really that we've come away with, we were really excited. Both Helen and I are sort of quite impatient. So we wanted to get on with it and plant lots of stuff. And the first 3 years we planted a lot, and then we've slowed down very deliberately since then. And this is sort of part of my thing earlier about dipping your toe in the water. If I grow an annual crop and it doesn't work, I'd try something different next year, different variety, different system, or don't grow it at all. I can be agile, I can change. We're only learning after 9 years to some extent whether some of the stuff we planted 9 years ago actually works or doesn't. And if we rush in and plant everything, then actually we could end up with a whole lot of stuff that doesn't work. Whereas what's the difference between now and 10 years for a tree in 100 years' time? It doesn't really matter. And while there is that urgency from a climate perspective to plant, actually these trees are having an almost immediate effect. So one field that's really wet, even 2 years after planting trees in, didn't sit in water over winter. So the trees were only up to my waist, but already they were affecting the movement of water in it. And then the change in management between the trees has also had that really immediate biodiversity. Within 3 months, we were seeing the barn owls and the kestrels and the buzzards coming in. We had orchids after 3 years. So some of this stuff that had just been grey sheep so quickly was revitalized and re-energized, even without big trees in it. So yeah, it's been fascinating.
Fantastic. And it's really interesting, of course, because in the same way that Joe is, doing this, the Allerton Project and other places are doing similar things. It's about, having these experimental opportunities, these trial areas that really mean that you're able to have that success and failure, which is just as important to an extent, so that other people don't necessarily have to have all of those failures if they're learning from the things that you're doing. So it's such important work and wonderful to hear about it. Thanks so much for coming on the programme. We're going to go to a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about Scotland's decision to reject the Committee on Climate Change recommendations for agriculture, about fossil fuel dependency, drainage, and keeping up with climate change. Cue music.
Just realised, Finno, as well, I didn't plug the show. Should we do that at the end, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Come back in and do that. Yeah, absolutely.
That's
fair. We'll do that immediately now. Welcome back. We're just realising, Ben and I were talking during the break and realised that Ben hadn't had a chance to plug the Agroforestry show. So, Ben, please do that.
Thanks, Finno. Yeah, I'm not doing my job properly, am I, for not plugging the show? So in September, 10th and 11th of September, we've got our second Agroforestry show. I'm sure some of your listeners came to the first one a couple of years ago. So it's a kind of groundswell for agroforestry, groundswell very much our inspiration. So talks and demonstrations, farm walks. We had 1,300 people came 2 years ago, and it's being held this time at our Wood Oaks Soil Association Wood Oaks Farm in Hertfordshire.
Wonderful. And just as we did a preview episode around Groundswell, we're going to do a preview episode around the Agroforestry show as well, showcasing some of the panels that are on and some of the work that's going to be taking place. That's really exciting. I'm looking forward to that. So we're going to move on. We're going to talk about Scottish Government. And I don't think we're going to spend too long on these next few stories because I know that Joe wants to talk about a couple of things, that are heretical, that aren't on 8.9 a bit later on. And I want to give him time to do that. So Scottish Government rejects the CCC recommendation to reduce livestock. NFU Scotland has welcomed a move by Scottish Government to reject advice from the UK Climate Change Committee on Agriculture and commit instead to a climate strategy that reflects the realities of Scottish land use, food production and rural life. So we got the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, Gillian Martin, saying Scotland is now halfway to our 2045 climate change target and is ahead of the UK as a whole in reducing long-term emissions. While we welcome some of the UK CCC's advice on how to stay within these limits, as they make clear, it is always up to us. It's up to Scotland to decide whether those policies are right for us. This means, for example, that we will chart our own path on forestry, going further than the Committee on Climate Change suggests, and to ensure that we protect rural communities and have a thriving rural economy. We will not adopt all their recommendations on agriculture and peatland, and will instead meet our targets in a way that works for rural Scotland, including supporting and protecting our iconic livestock industries. And so again, I mean, this is just re-rehearsing, isn't it, to an extent, the things that we were talking about in that sort of first part of the show, that at last, I mean, frankly, there is some recognition by a government in the UK that emissions are not the only game in town, that they're super important. But in terms of agriculture, we need to be focusing on carbon cycling. We need to be looking at how to increase woodland and forestry, biodiversity, soil health, water, and getting the best use of the available land rather than just forcing a system onto that land. And sort of critical within that, I've just recorded, again, it'll go out in 2 or 3 weeks, a net zero podcast with some of the farmers who are part of that net zero research that we talked about last time around. The idea that if for example, Scotland stops producing beef or dairy, the demand for that doesn't go down. It's just that those emissions get exported, and either they get exported to England or they get exported elsewhere outside of the UK. And that doesn't help with climate change, because climate change is happening globally. And of course, there's also the element that adaptation needs to be regarded alongside mitigation. Joe, do you want to come in?
Yeah, and there's a few things there, isn't it? I mean, this whole piece really goes back to what we were talking about last time in terms of the Tony Blair Institute report, essentially saying that governments need to be a little bit more realistic about climate change in terms of the messaging that they're giving out, the policies that they're implementing in order to keep people on board. And of course, yes, why is the Scottish government doing this? Because, well, frankly, farming is a much more important part of their economy. And farmers are a larger part of the voting public. And because, yeah, the red meat sector is actually really important in Scotland in a way that it's obviously not considered to be here in England. Now, you mentioned the supermarkets that, you mentioned there, Finlo, essentially if we're not producing it here to relatively high standards, we'll be sucking it in from elsewhere. Now, we are exactly seeing that already. In recent weeks, we've seen, Uruguayan beef on the shelves at Asda. We've seen New Zealand and Australian beef on the shelves at Sainsbury's and Morrison's. So we are starting to see that. So absolutely, if we're not doing everything we can to have to have environmentally and climate friendly to the greatest extent that we can beef produced in this country, we are going to be sucking it in from abroad. We're already doing it. That's just the reality of market economics. So it's great to see the Scottish government taking this stand. Again, I guess it's because essentially politically it's easier for them to do it. And yeah, let's hope that some of this common sense does start to leak out across the border into England.
Common sense leaking out, that would be really good, wouldn't it? You mentioned the net zero conversation we had last time and the Tony Blair Institute report. And a couple of pieces of feedback I had from that, Joe, that might be interesting to you. Somebody got in touch and said, listen, if you're talking about the Tony Blair Institute report, you simply cannot do that without talking about where the funding for the Institute comes from. And of course, a lot of that is coming from Saudi and other places like that. I think my own view on that is that while the funding is important, actually the message is more important. And if that message rings true with things that we think are important in terms of land use, then let's talk about it. And yeah, okay, let's acknowledge where the funding comes from, but that doesn't undermine the significance of the findings from the Tony Blair Institute, I don't think, in this instance. And the other, and I'm not going to embarrass the person by saying who it is that sent this through, Joe, but I'm going to read it out to you because it's a lovely pat on the back for us both. It just says, I just listened to your podcast with Joe on net zero on the way up to Carbon Calling, and I wanted to say the content of your output is by far the best and most well informed of everything I'm listening to at the moment. So there you go. There's a rave review for you, Joe.
I wonder what else they're listening to.
It
wasn't
that was my
Ben,
first
was
question.
It? Is that how Ben got his seat this week?
It worked.
Anyway, and I'm going to move on to fossil fuels, and this is an article that just went onto the site this morning. So I'm sort of looking for my notes again. This is rising oil prices and global tensions expose the food system's fossil fuel dependence. So this is a report from IPES Food. Now, I've spoken about IPES Food in the past, and they've often appeared on 8.9.com. And with the previous head in your chair, it's like Wurzel Gummidge, different heads on the guests for wheat from the chaff, Joe. When I was talking to Phil in the past, we talked, a fair bit about IPES Food. They are a superb think tank based in Brussels. They do an awful lot of really good work. Although I have to say that I think the best report they've done to date was from Uniformity to Diversity, which is back in 2016. It really was an absolutely powerhouse of a report sort of promoting the role of agroecology in delivering resilient food systems. But they have been absurdly focused on emissions reduction, I would say, as well, and therefore sort of missing the importance of the language change that's necessary. And it's sort of 2 years ago now that the GAF, the Global Alliance on the Future of Food, they unveiled a landmark report at that time that centered on the role of fossil fuels. And I'm really pleased, although it's sort of a couple of years later, I am so pleased that IPES Food has caught up on this and added some useful numbers into the mix, because that shift from attention on simply emissions reduction to fossil fuels, I think, is so important in terms of understanding actually what fossil fuels are doing, where the emissions are coming from, and how we can improve that carbon cycling and get towards the adaptation piece, as well as just focusing on the mitigation. Anyway, they're drawing attention to the fact that 40% of all global petrochemicals are now consumed by food systems. And again, if you compare that with the, some would say 15%, some would say more, the emissions that are associated with food and agriculture, that's 40% of all global petrochemicals now being consumed by food systems. 99% of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers and pesticides derived from fossil fuels. 1/3 of all petrochemicals going towards producing those synthetic fertilizers. So again, it just emphasizes the importance of getting fossil fuels out, or at least reducing dramatically the number of fossil fuels that are used within the food systems, Joe.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm sure Ben's got something to say on this with his Soil Association hat on. But I mean, for what it's worth, I looked at my home farm, 5 years ago. I looked at going organic, mostly because I was really worried about being so dependent on that external input, which was, yes, A, very expensive, B, very variable in terms of whether you could even get it. And we're seeing that increasingly so now, 2022 being the really sort of low watermark, if you like, with that. But yeah, the environmental impact, absolutely. But for me, as a farm business, it was primarily the dependency on that expensive and volatile input. And I've just written a piece for Scribehound, really just saying food security. We can't just be, it's not just what you can produce in a good year. If everything goes right and the weather's good, we've got to think about food security more in terms of, well, what happens if the fertilizer stops coming into the country? That is a food security issue. And again, so that's where organic, of course, comes into its own with those closed nutrient loops. And that's where, for me, regenerative and that increasing harking back to those more organic systems, which, of course, were just conventional systems pre-war, right? It's only since the Second World War and the kind of the industrialization of agriculture that we start to call that sort of conventional agriculture. That regenerative focus on adopting more organic rotations, those wider leguminous rotations, fantastic. We need to do that more, just as a resilience piece, I think, for farm businesses and food security and all the rest of it. Absolutely. So yeah, no, this is a big issue. I'll hand over to Ben.
Yeah, well, just before you do, I just want to sort of go on to that whole dependency in terms of global trade, because as you say, creating resilience by reducing dependency on fossil fuels. But why is that a problem? And of course, we all know that there is so much instability around the world that seems to be getting worse on a monthly, let alone annual basis, in terms of the power struggles and the conflicts, wars that are going on. Just in this last week, we've been worrying about the Strait of Hormuz in terms of Iran and Israel and that struggle. Although, as we speak this morning, there's a bit of a hiatus and a holding ceasefire. Who knows what's going to happen tomorrow or the week after, and the impact that will have on fossil fuel prices, on oil prices around the world. And of course, nutrition is also important. And when we're talking about fossil fuels and the amount that's used in synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, when all that's going into the soil, that impacts on soil health. And of course, it gets into the food that's produced. And so it then impacts on nutritional levels and on chronic disease in terms of human beings and the things that we are eating and our ability to think and do the things that we need to in terms of and so the impact on the economic productivity of a country overall is impacted if we have all these things continuing to go into food and leading to to more disease and illness within human beings as well. And of course, the whole ultra processed food aspect is entirely interlinked with fossil fuel use as well. And so there's so much that we could talk about there, but we don't really have time.
To an extent, I mean, you could have organic, milling wheat of the highest possible quality. You could still stick it in a Krispy Kreme donut, and it's still going to be bad for you. So I think that we can push that too far. And I would just like what I said before about organic systems and that resilience piece, absolutely. But as a conventional farmer myself, I still would. And here at the Allerton Project, we're not organic. There is still an absolutely critical role, I believe, for agrochemicals and fertilizers in the modern food system, where we have to feed 10 billion people by the middle of the century. Now, again, I'll pass over to Ben at this point. I wouldn't want to push kind of that we must get rid of fossil fuels from the food production system too far for me, because I still think if we're going to burn them for something, producing food is one of the important things we do as a society, right? We've got to reduce them. We can find greener and cleaner ways to do it, but they remain important. And that's kind of where we are at the minute.
But Joe, there is a big difference between the amount of chemicals that you're using on your farm at the Allerton Project and some of the other farms, perhaps in the east of England or across, certainly in the USA, and the amount of petrochemicals that they are using.
Yeah, we can always be better. We can always be better.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're not talking here about eliminating fossil fuels, certainly not in the short term in terms of those synthetics. We are recognizing that they are vastly overused and they do have an impact. And then it's all about trade-offs, isn't it? In terms of trade-offs on soil health, trade-offs on production, trade-offs on the food that's actually produced and the health elements related to that. So, it's not about one or the other. It's about how we transition from one to the other, and recognizing that a fossil fuel lens gives us a different approach and a different understanding of the food system to an emissions reduction lens. We keep promising to go over to Ben. Ben.
That's fine. I think you guys have actually done a very good job of explaining the organic principles, so it's good. But yeah, no, I think there's a couple of things. And one is, while of course I would love every farmer to be organic, I also recognise that that's not going to happen in the very near future. I think reductions are also great. And I think the more farmers like Joe reduce it, the more they realise they don't need to use as much, and they can reduce it, and actually sometimes their crops might do better. And as you said, the food quality and the soil health will increase. But it's almost, for me, it's about looking at it through a slightly different lens. And, yield has been the metric, hasn't it, for a lot of farmers. And actually, I think we need to be looking at calories out versus calories in. And the most effective, or efficient systems are actually hand-grown crops, because you get 10 calories out for 1 calorie in. Now clearly that's not financially or economically work in our system today, but if you could get closer to that rather than the 10 calories into 1 calorie out, or the 6 calories into 1 calorie out for sort of more industrial farming, even large scale organic farming is, I think, 3 or 4 calories in for 1 calorie out. So they're unbelievably inefficient systems actually from an energy point of view. So the more we can do to get that back to at least 1 to 1, but ideally 1 to more, that for me is the driver. And we know that, as you said, Joe, these high input systems in perfect conditions work amazingly, and you get massive yields, but you get high winds at the wrong time, or you get drought at the wrong time, and this is the trouble with some of the. I mean, it's the trouble with a monocultural system, effectively, because if every one of your plants is genetically identical, they're all at risk from the same thing. So you can breed it to be drought resistant, or you can breed it to be resistant to particular pests. But unless that's your problem every year, then you're in trouble. And what we're seeing now is 1 year it'll be a drought, the next year it'll be a hurricane, the next year, so what you need is something that's robust and resilient and will give you a sustainable yield every year rather than a maximum yield. So it's really changing the narrative and what a successful system looks like for me.
Lovely. Thanks, Ben. I'm noticing that we have a hard guillotine in about 10 minutes when Joe has to go off to another meeting. But Joe, let's move on to these last couple of articles that we wanted to talk about. And this is your pick from the New Scientist. World's farmers won't be able to keep up with climate change.
Yeah, and it really feeds into a lot of what we've been talking about today in terms of system resilience, etc. But it basically saying that for every 1 degree warming that we're going to see between now and the end of the century, we're going to see a drop of around 120 kilocalories per person every day that we can produce from our 6 staple crops. So wheat, rice, millet, sorghum, maize, soya, with the only one of those 6 crops that might actually do better in a warming climate being rice, of course, if the water is available in order to grow it, right? So this kind of took this study from the University of Illinois took account of mitigation measures, adaptation measures that farmers can take in growing these crops, and it still came out with the fact that basically, for example, I think with maize, we're looking at between a 12 and a 28% drop in the amount of maize that we are going to be able to produce globally between now and the end of the century. Now, this is obviously a huge issue, right? And we know that climate change is going to impact on our food system. My farming career since 2018, it has been as clear as the nose on your face that climate change is having a huge impact on agriculture here in the UK. For me, that's when it really started. Every season is extreme. We just need to accept this. We need to accept that this is going to happen, that we're not just in a bit of a dodgy rut at the minute in terms of bad weather. Next year is not going to be better. We are going to continue to experience this. Farmers need to accept that, I think, but then policymakers need to accept that. We're always talking now about, again, national security and the importance of resilient economy. We're finally coming around to that because of what's going on geopolitically around the world at the minute. Food security is still absolutely nowhere. It is not a part of that conversation. And we're not just talking about what happens if, if a foreign state does something. We should also be thinking about what happens when we get global climate crisis in any given year. Food is not going to be readily available. It doesn't matter how rich we are. We are not going to be able to source it if it doesn't exist.
Let me just
and this is something that we do need to take seriously.
Let me just say something fairly brief and then ask you to respond to it, because for my money, this piece is predicated on asking the wrong question, although it gives us the opportunity then to ask the right question. And the wrong question seems to me is, can business as usual be sustained? And this is the point at which it seems to be coming from. We need these 6 staple crops. How can we sustain them? Climate change is going to have a negative impact. I think the right question is, how can we build resilient food systems? And those resilient food systems may not simply be based on those staple crops or on. So it's about sort of seeing whether we can increase the diversity within those crops themselves, increase and change the diets of people so that they are eating different things, having and all those things that we talked about before in terms of nutrition. That the more diverse the plate, the better the nutritional outcomes and the elements and the biodiversity regeneration within the land, the soil health, rotation, etc. So the question should be about how can we deliver diversity. So I guess the value of this piece is that it yet again points to the fact that climate change is having an immediate impact and effect on those things that we currently consider staple crops within a business as usual system. But surely the question is, well, okay, maybe we shouldn't be relying on these staple crops to the extent that we are, and how do we create resilience?
I agree, especially when we know that, let's be honest, climate change is now locked in. We're at 1.5. Who knows where we'll get to by the end of the century? So, no, I couldn't agree more. And again, here, the farm in the landscape at the Allerton Project that we're farming, I'm sure we will still be farming this in 20, 30 years' time. But I have very little doubt myself that what we will be farming here needs to be different in order to create that resilience for us as a farm business. But again, the problem there we've got, isn't it, Finlo, that, and Ben will have been talking about these issues for much, much longer than I have. We need to have that societal conversation around our diet. And I'm not talking about diets as in less meat, right? That's the only societal conversation we ever have. We need to be having a societal conversation around more fruit. Where's it grown? Where's the water coming from? And then, of course, there's all the market factors that still militate against the fact that we only have 40% apple self-sufficiency in this country, when it's something we could easily be self-sufficient in and eat more of and all the rest of it, but we don't, because farmers can't get a fair return for that product here. So yes, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's about more, as you say, people talk about less meat and dairy, and then that puts the backs up of people who are producing meat and dairy. And we shouldn't be talking about less. We should be talking about more high quality, this, that, and the other, more food that's been produced in good quality soil, more resilience in the system, more of these things. And that requires diversity in order to achieve that resilience. Ben, thoughts from you?
Yeah, diversity for me is the king in everything. Whenever I farm, it's about diversity. It's about diversity of crops, diversity of varieties, diversity of genetics within that variety, diversity of markets. Everything that it makes things complex, but it makes it resilient. And I think that's the only way we're going to survive.
Joe, the last article that we're going to talk about today, the last item, is a piece that you wrote, I believe, for Direct Driller magazine, that regenerative agriculture starts underground. What do you mean? Talk us through it.
Briefly, drainage, field drainage, right? I think this is an issue we need to be talking about. Not just farmers. Farmers know how important field drainage is, to essentially stop soils from becoming waterlogged. It's something that the supply chain needs to be thinking about. It's something that government needs to be thinking about. Most of the drainage schemes that we currently have under our fields, and just for those who might not be aware, most arable and horticultural fields, certainly here in the UK, will have a series of pipes, gravity-fed pipes under them, which will take away excess rainfall. And that means that the fields don't become waterlogged, which means you can grow crops in them, which means you can put tractors on them. Most of those schemes went in the post-war period up until about the 1980s. And since then, when the generous grants to help do that for food security reasons were got rid of, we stopped, we essentially stopped doing that. And those schemes, of course, are coming to the end of their natural lives. Climate change is exacerbating that. And we're starting to see more waterlogged soils, more challenges in growing our crops. Now, of course, regenerative agriculture is often put forward as a way to improve soil health, things like cover crops and bycrops, those rooting structures to help water get away. Absolutely. However, you can't plant a cover crop if your field is waterlogged. We can't regen our way out of bad field drainage. The level of investment that will be required on a national level, I believe, in order to get us back up to where we need to be and future-proof us, in order to provide for food security, but also to provide for environmental benefits, because waterlogged soils are bad for the climate, they're bad for our water quality. We need to be talking about this. We need to be thinking about this. And at the minute, nobody is, because it's too big a thing. And actually, most people aren't aware of it. Unless you're a farmer, most people don't even know these things are down there doing their thing quietly day after day. And I'd like to get it further up the political agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's not particularly pretty, not particularly known about, but something which is crucially important. And when you sent me an email saying that you wanted to talk about this, I went directly to the WhatsApp group, Regen Ag Chat UK, and asked them to have a read of the article and see what they thought, come back with some thoughts. And I think that the key thing actually is very similar to what you've said, that they are really important, that drainage is really important, but soil health is also important. And as ever, it's regen is about being context specific, that it's about looking at your individual farm and trying to work out the best approach. And it may be that some farms, don't need as much drainage as others, or don't need any at all, and that soil health and soil resilience that you can build that holding capacity, that water holding capacity, without the need for drainage, but that generally speaking, it's going to be a combination of the two, that one complements the other. And I guess my concern is that there's often too much focus on drainage as the mechanical intervention, the solution that farmers are used to, because they're sort of used to thinking of interventionist solutions, and not enough thought is given to the role of soil. But the reality is that it's a need for both.
I completely take all that on board. Of course, again, it's always a nuanced issue, and generally, of course, soil health is essential, that we build it with more regenerative and organic practices. But I do fundamentally believe that there is that kind of we shouldn't shy away from the fact that engineering solution, just because it is an engineering solution doesn't make it the wrong solution. And I think fundamentally, again, you can't plant a cover crop in a waterlogged soil, and I think it does. The context, of course, incredibly important. But I think for the most part, yes, we do need to have both of those things going alongside each other, and this just needs to be a conversation that I would like to think that people were aware of, and that's, for me, that's the big challenge, because it's been 40 years since we've been doing this as a country. That institutional memory, except for farmers, has really gone out of the building. So I think, and that's why we're trying to get a drainage research project going here this autumn at the Allerton Project, which I think will return some really interesting data, again, especially on the environmental side of the benefits.
Fantastic. Yeah, that really, it sounds like a cry for help, that we need to really be thinking about this, that there was, a big investment post-war, and there was a lot of work into drainage, but now there is a need for that investment again, a need to repair and make sure that that drainage is still working in the future, because the rains certainly aren't getting any lighter, are they? Ben, I wonder if you could just give us a few final thoughts before we sign out.
Yeah, listening to all of the discussions today, a lot of it is around systems thinking, holistic thinking, isn't it? And not jumping for one particular solution, whether that's carbon or, even drainage. Everything is part of this and needs to be considered. Trees, cover crops, soil, markets, supply chains, really being able to take in everything that you can and not get too focused and zoned into one narrow way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. That was brilliant. Lovely to take us out at the end there, Ben. Thank you very much. So thank you to our guest, Ben Raskin from the Soil Association. Next time, we're going to be speaking to Nikki Yoxall. She's going to be joining us. Please check out Farmgate's Filling the Funding Gap series, as well as Farmgate Leaders. And we've got new episodes coming up with John Kempf and then Andy Cato. Then later in the year, Rebecca Tickell, who's the producer of Kiss the Ground and Common Ground. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the USC Catchment Partnership, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain.
I'm on Rural Broadband, and I'm Joe Stanley.
And I've been Ben Raskin.
Thanks very much, everyone. Bye for now.